All right, so section 1.3, remember we're doing quadratics, okay? And quadratics have a lot to do with parabolas and things like that, okay? Um, Now, the thing about parabolas is sometimes they didn't have solutions, right? We talked about that yesterday. Sometimes you have two answers, sometimes you get one answer, sometimes you get no answers. But even when a parabola has no solutions, it can have what they call imaginary units. Okay. Now I know it sounds kind of weird, like, wait a minute, we're dealing with imaginary numbers. That is true. We deal with imaginary numbers. Why are imaginary numbers used? Well, every single rocket that Elon Musk's company sends up to space deals with imaginary numbers because in space, imaginary units actually gain meaning. Okay, so yeah, these numbers may be imaginary in a sense, but they make sense when you're dealing with zero gravity. So space travel is possible because of these types of numbers. Okay, the square root of a -1. Normally, in eighth grade, they would have been like, nope, you can't have negative numbers inside of a square root. I mean, in eighth grade, yeah, they don't want you to use those, but here you can. We can do. Okay. So you guys should have, at least I think you should have seen this before, right? The imaginary unit I. I is equal to the square root of -1. Now, if you square I, then that means you square the square root. You get rid of it and you just get -1. So I is the square root of -1. I squared is just -1. Okay, now there's a little hint right here, and I'll write something above it. It says, if you see a negative in a square root, bring it out as an I. So in other words, and we're going to see that in example 1, but if you see something like this, the square root of -2, then just write it I square root of 2. Okay? Because inside is the -2 is basically -1 times 2. The square root of -1 is I. So in here, there's a square root of -1. That's why there's a negative number. Okay? Um, so just take it out, and then you'll have I square root of 2. Okay? So do me a favor, try to do it. I think we've had enough time pass. Uh, yeah, I think we're okay. So see if it'll work. So yeah, anytime you see a negative in a square root, bring it out as an I. So right here, square root of -2 is I square root of 2. Okay, so don't forget to do that. That's kind of like a little shortcut to doing some work. Okay, like I told you guys, I want to show you guys shortcuts when I can, so that they can help you get the work done faster, so it makes more sense. Okay, did it work? Okay. So, all right, let's look at example number 1. So we're only going to do, I think, 2 examples, but example 1 has like A, B, C, D. Okay, but we're only going to do 2 examples. Now remember, I is the square root of -1. I squared is just -1. Okay, make sure you wrote that down. Um, so, and if you didn't, just really quick snapshot right there, imaginary unit portion. Okay, I is the square root of -1. I squared is -1. We're going to use this stuff. Okay. So when I say we need to simplify, we're going to be using some stuff you guys learned in Algebra 1 and probably even Math 8. Okay. But first, they tell me to simplify the square root of -50. Now, I just told you guys that if you see a negative inside the square root, you rewrite it with an I on the outside. So I square root of 50. Bless you. So, all right, first step, we're good. But now I got to figure out the square root of 50. Now, some of you guys are going to say that, well, that's easy on the calculator. You can do it on the calculator if you'd like, okay? I'm not going to take that option away from you. But you cannot do I square root of 50. Your calculator won't know how to do that. But it can do square root of 50. But if you didn't have a calculator, what you're supposed to do is try to figure out how to break up 50 into 2 numbers, one of which has a nice square root. So I'm about to spend a little bit of time, kind of wasted time, but just as a reminder, what numbers have square roots, okay? So number 1 is the square root of 1. 2, if you get a square root of 4, right? These are things you guys are supposed to know, but sometimes some people don't remember all of these. So here we go. I'm writing down your square roots. I'm going to go up to 12, okay? So actually, I'm going to go up to 16 if I can. So 1 is the square root of 1, right? 2 is the square root of 4. 3 is the square root of 9. 4 is the square root of 16. 5 is the square root of 25. 6, that's the square root of 36. 7 is the square root of 49. 8 is the square root of 64. Okay, let's jump over to the right side. 9 would be the square root of 81. 10 is the square root of 100. Most of you guys learned up to there. Okay, I'm going to say like probably 80% of you guys learned up to the square root of 100 and your teachers kind of stopped. Some of your teachers decided we're going to go a little bit further. Let's go up to 12. Okay, 11. That's the square root of what? Anybody remember? Square root of what is 11? It's 100 and 121. Okay, 121. Okay, and then 12, you might remember this one. It's 144. 144. And then some teachers say, we'll stop right there. That's a lot. If you were one of my students, I would have made you go 4 more. 13. That's 169. 14. 196. 15. That's 225. And 16 is 256. That's what I usually make my students memorize, because as you start to do more and more math, these are more common. 16, 15, 14, 13, you'll see these pop out a lot. So I'm like, might as well memorize them up to there. After that, you just do your 20s, your 20, your 30, your 40, your 50, 60. 25 is a good one as well, 625. So, but I kind of stopped there. I said, look, just make sure you know those. Okay? Now, why is it good for us to know those? Well, I have the square root of 50, okay? I need to break up 50 into 2 numbers. Either both of those numbers or one of those 2 numbers has to have a nice square root. So, if I break up 50 into 2 times 25, which one of these 2 numbers has a nice square root? Does 2 have a square root? The square root of 2? Do you see a square root of 2 here somewhere? No, right? I see a square root of 1 and I see a square root of 4, but there's no square root of 2. What about 25? Is there a square root to 25? Yeah, 5. Okay, so 2 times 25, I'm going to use that 25 as a square root. That becomes a 5. So I get 5i square root of 2. And this is my answer. Okay? Since the square root of 25 is 5, I get to take it out. Okay? And then just put 5i on the outside. You just multiply the numbers on the outside. The square root of 2 doesn't actually, well, it exists, but it's a decimal. We're not going to do that. We're just going to leave it alone. But the square root of 2 is right in between the square root of 1 and the square root of 4. But it doesn't have a nice square root. So we just leave it alone. But the goal is for us to break down numbers into a product of 2 numbers, one of them having a nice square root. Okay? So sometimes both of them, but we'll see. Okay? So let's look at part B. By the way, you're going to notice it says example 1, A, B, C, because I'm not doing any of the homework problems right now because there's only like one of these. There's only one of these types right here. So there's only 1A, 1B type of look. I don't want to do the only one. So I got to give you an example. Okay? So look at this one right here. Now remember what I told you. If you see a negative in the square root, take out the I right away. Okay? So I'm going to rewrite this as I square root of 2 times I square root of 20. Okay? Now let's multiply. You can multiply inside square roots. We learned that before. So I times I is I squared. Square root of 2 times square root of 20 is square root of 40. Now let's remember back to what we started with. What's I squared? Look at your notes. What is I squared equal to? -1. So instead of I squared, I'm going to write negative. You don't have to write -1. Just put negative. It's the same thing. Okay? Now 40. I got to break this down into 2 numbers because there is no square root to 40. If you want to look at your chart, look, I'll put it right there. No square root to 40. There's a square root to 36. There's a square root to 49, but not to 40. Give me two numbers that multiply to 40, one of which has a nice square root. What two numbers can I multiply together? One of them will have a nice square root. Anybody have it? I'll give you a hint. 10 times 4, right? Does 10 have a nice square root? If you look, no. Does 4? Yeah, the square root of 4 is 2, right? So I'm going to break this up into 4 times 10. The square root of 4 is 2, so this becomes negative 2 square root of 10. What are the only factors of 10 that I can use besides 1 and 10? 1 times 10 is 10. What else is 10? 5 and 2. Does 5 and 2 have a nice square root? Is there a square root for 5 or a square root for 2? No, so that means I'm done. I can't break it up anymore. So this is my final answer right here. Okay? That's going to be my final answer. I still tried to break down 10, but it doesn't work. Now, sometimes people don't like to do it in their head, so let me just show you a way that sometimes I tell people to do it. If you're trying to figure out factors for 10, you can just make a list. 1 times 10, 2 times 5. And then just ask yourself, okay, these are all the factors for 10. Does 1 have a square root? Yeah. But we never use this. We never use the combination with 1. So does 2 have a square root? No. 5? No. So then there's nothing I can do with 10. Remember, you never use the 1 times portion of it. Okay? For 40, you could have done this. 1 times 40. 2 times 20. 4 times 10. What else? 5 times 8. Those are all the factors for 40. All of them are right here. Remember, don't use the 1 times, so cross this one out. 2 and 20, 4 and 10, 5 and 8. Which one of these numbers is the only one that has a nice square root? 4. That's why I use 4 times 10. Okay? So I'm doing this in my head, but if you need to see it on paper, go ahead and write it out. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? All right. Are we okay with the first two here? So again, this is kind of review. You guys did that last year. Now, I to the 10th, that one's a little bit more tricky. Now, I'll show you how to do it more on the basic level, okay? Because a lot of times people are like, I don't know how to do I to the 10th. I just know I and I to the 2nd. That's all you told us, right? So if you want to, I'm going to remind you of a little property that you guys should know. So if you have x to the a times x to the b, that's x to the a plus b. This is a property that you guys learned in Algebra 1 or Math 1. Okay? Make a pass. But in Math 1, you guys learned this. Okay? In other words, you can split up a power into multiple pieces. In other words, I to the 10th, I can rewrite it as I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared. That's the same thing as I to the 10th. Just add up the powers. 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8, plus 2 is 10. These are the same. What's I squared again? Negative 1. So I'm going to write negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. Well, what's negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1? It's negative 1. Because negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1. Positive 1 times a negative 1, negative 1. Negative 1 times a negative 1, that's a positive 1. Positive 1 times a negative 1, negative 1. okay? Or get your calculator, punch it in, okay? But there you go. I to the 10th is a negative 1. Again, we're dealing a lot with this I value right now, okay? So after this one, then I think we have this one, and then we're done, okay? So are we okay with that? So if it was I to the 6th, I would write I squared, I squared, I squared. That's I to the 6th. If it was I to the 14th, I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared. Right? 7 times, I'd write it out. Okay? There are shortcuts to it, but sometimes people don't like them because you're going to use a power to a power. So I don't know if anybody here would do this, but this is this is the way I would do it. I squared to the 5th. You guys remember a power to a power is a product? So 2 times 5 is 10. I squared is negative 1, so negative 1 to the 5th is just negative 1. But this is negative 1 to the 5th right here. It's the same thing. But this is just a little more intuitive. But if you don't like it, you don't have to do it that way. Just work it out. Okay? Math doesn't have to be done the fastest way. Just we're hoping you're doing it the right way. Okay? So hold on one second. P7 Vina. Hi. Oh, I sent him to Marissa. 20 is the from what they told me. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys want to order an extra, but yeah, that's what I heard. 20. I think so, especially if it starts to grow a little bit more next year. Bye. All right, so where was I at? Sorry about that. So let me erase this just to not confuse anybody. Let's do this last one, okay? And then we're gonna do the solving, and then we're finished. So right here we have negative 2i times 3i quantity squared. Now I'm going to remind you of a little property you're supposed to know from Algebra 1. Okay, a times b to a power is a to the power b to the power. Okay, so if you have something in a parenthesis and they're being multiplied together to a specific power, you distribute that power. Okay, it has to be multiplication though, not addition, not subtraction. Multiplication inside the parenthesis. So that means that this right here, I'm going to kind of rewrite it, should look like this. 3 squared I squared. Okay, because the 2 gets given to the 3, it's given to the I. All right, let's simplify a little bit. Negative 2i. 3 squared is 9, and I squared is negative 1. Well, this is a negative 9, right? That's negative 9. Negative 9 times negative 2, that's positive 18. So this becomes 18i, and I'm done. Okay? So just kind of work through it slowly. Okay? It's the biggest thing that you can make mistakes on math. It's not that you get things wrong as you rush through it, right? If you take a little bit of time, it usually you make less mistakes. So we're going to do one more and we're done. Okay? Like I said, we're only doing half today. That's why I'm kind of taking it slow. We're not trying to rush through it. All right, last problem. They're going to have you guys solving things. Okay? They're going to have you guys solving things. Now, these solutions are probably going to end up with imaginary numbers. Now, the great thing about this, it doesn't say solve by graphing, because that's what it said yesterday. And you saw, if you did the homework, it took some time, right? You had to find axis of symmetry, find your vertex, make a chart, graph the picture, figure out where the solutions are, right? Not necessarily the fastest process, okay? And I was speaking to one of you guys earlier today. I still do it that way. Whenever I have to solve by graphing, the way I taught you guys yesterday, I do it. I have over 30 years doing this. I still do it the same way because that's the most streamlined way to solve. Unless I want to graph it on like Desmos, then that's different, right? But if I have to do it by hand, I'm going to do it the way I taught you guys. Axis of symmetry, vertex, chart, graph. Okay. This one doesn't say anything about graphing. Thank goodness. So they just want us to solve. So here we go. Whenever they want you to solve an equation and it has a variable, what they want you to do is get the variable all by itself. Okay. So let's move this this 150 over here and move it over so it becomes a negative 150. So it's 3x squared equals to negative 150. Now, I'm supposed to get the x by itself. So let me get that 3. I'm going to divide it out. So I divide by 3. X squared is equal to negative 50. Okay? Now, I still need to get x by itself. Right now it says x squared. So how do you get rid of a square? I saw your hand motion. How do you get rid of a square? Square root, right? Square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay? But I want to remind you guys of something. Anytime you guys take a square root, something goes in front of it. Anybody remember what goes right in front of a square root? It's 2 symbols. Yeah, plus or minus. Okay, don't forget about that. So it's plus or minus. Now, on the left side, we have x. On the right side, well, this is plus or minus square root of negative 50. We already told you guys if you see a negative inside the square root, bring it out as an I. So it's going to be plus or minus I square root of 50. We literally just did the square root of 50 earlier, right? I think it was the very first problem. We broke down 50 into 2 times 25. And we found out that 2 doesn't have a nice square root, but 25 does, right? What's the square root of 25 again? 5, right? So I'm going to bring the 5 out. X is equal to plus or minus 5i square root of 2. And these are my 2 solutions. Notice I said 2 solutions, plus or minus, right? One of them is positive 5i radical 2. The other one is negative 5i radical 2. So for your homework today, you're only going to, if you want to, you're only going to work on the first 8 problems. And then the last 5 problems we'll do tomorrow. Okay? And I think tomorrow it starts off easy, and then the last 2 problems are a little bit of a pain. So yeah. So that's why we cut it in 2 parts. Let me go ahead and pause this and then give you guys a homework.